Coming up today, Korea's central bank holds the key interest rate steady at a record low of 1.5% in July, but cuts the nation's growth outlook due to the unfavorable effects of the MERS outbreak. Korea's minimum wage will rise more than 8% next year to roughly $5.30 an hour. But labor unions walked out of the negotiations as they wanted a much bigger increase. Plus, Korea's ruling party ponders over who should be its next floor leader after Yoo Seong-min bowed to pressure to step down. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Thursday, the 9th of July. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Broome. Our top story this afternoon. Korea's central bank has decided to freeze its key interest rate at a record low 1.5% after cutting the rate last month. But it has slashed its growth outlook for this year to 2.8%. That's down from 3.1%. And it cited slow domestic spending in the wake of the MERS outbreak. Yoo Seong-min starts us off.
The Bank of Korea is keeping its key benchmark rate on hold for the second month in a row at an all-time low of 1.5%. The rate freeze, announced after a monthly monetary policy meeting on Thursday, gives the central bank more time to assess the effects of the previous rate cut, a quarter percentage point drop in June. The rate cut was in line with the government's efforts to boost the economy and encourage spending in the wake of the MERS outbreak, on top of the country's sliding exports. Experts say, however, that the spread of the MERS virus is just a minor addition to a larger issue hampering growth.
Without structural reforms, the economy is likely to stay in the current low-growth phase, suppressing consumers' tendency to spend.
The central bank also cut its growth forecast for this year after the government lowered its growth target of 3.1%, down 0.7 percentage points, citing the fallout from the MERS outbreak. To keep the country's growth in the 3% range, the finance ministry vowed to pump in 22 trillion won, or $19.6 billion in the second half of the year to spur domestic spending. Yoo Seong-min, Arirang News.
Now, after a dozen meetings and weeks of wrangling between Labour and management, Korea's minimum wage for next year has been set. But the spat isn't quite over yet, as the government and management still face strong opposition from unions that are planning to strike against the decision. Han Dan reports.
Korea's minimum wage for next year has been set at 6,031 per hour, up 8.1% from this year. That's about $5.30. When calculated into a monthly wage, given an employee works 209 hours, it's about 1.26 million won, or roughly $1,100. The Minimum Wage Council of Korea approved the wage hike late Wednesday during a full member meeting, the 12th of its kind, despite the notable absence of the labor unions. Only 16 members of government bodies and employers' associations were present, as all 9 labor union members walked out of the vote in opposition. The unions assert that a double-digit raise is the minimum necessary to ease the burden on workers who are struggling to make ends meet. The Korea Employers Federation, on the other hand, says a big jump could expose small and mid-sized firms to greater risk as uncertainties from the MERS outbreak and the Great Debt crisis linger. Korea's minimum wage was increased by 2.7% in 2010 and 5.1% the following year, and by 7.1% in 2015. It stood at about 4,101 in 2010, 4,301 in 2011, and 5,601 in 2015. The Minister of Employment and Labor will officially fix and notify the approved minimum wage by August 5th, after a 20-day objection period ends. Han Dan, Arirang News.
In a move to offset the economic impacts of falling exports and the MERS outbreak, the government is seeking to attract at least $4 billion in new investments to Korea's tourism, venture capital and construction sectors. At a trade and investment promotion meeting today, led by President Park Geun-hye, the Culture Ministry pledged to launch a global campaign promoting that it's safe to travel to Korea and develop targeted programs for tourists of different ages and nationalities. The government will also establish a venture ecosystem in which growth and returns are guaranteed and ease regulations to spur facilities reconstruction and renovation. As for the country's weakened exports, the government will cooperate with the private sector to enhance the global competitiveness of Korean exports and offer financial support to small and mid-sized firms seeking to expand their trade volume. Now, with the resignation of its floor leader, Yoo Seong-min, on Wednesday, the ruling Saenuri Party now faces the challenge of choosing who should represent its 160 lawmakers at the National Assembly. Now, under party regulations, a new floor leader must be selected within a week, either through a vote or a consensus decision. Now, two lawmakers have emerged as strong candidates for this position. Four-term lawmaker and former Maritime Minister Lee Joo-yong, who is a President Park loyalist, and three-term lawmaker Joo Ho-young, who has broader support from both the pro and non-pro President Park factions. Now, local media outlets are reporting the party might use consensus to make the decision rather than a vote in order to avoid further internal conflict between the factions. Production at the inter-Korean Kaesong industrial complex has jumped this year from the year before, and this comes as quite a surprise, as tensions have been high at the park following North Korea's unilateral decision in February to hike wages for its workers there. Connie Kim reports.
The ongoing wage row at the inter-Korean Kaesong industrial complex, the last functioning symbol of inter-Korean cooperation, has not affected production. Seoul's Unification Ministry said Thursday the total value of production at the industrial park from January to April this year came in at more than $185 million, jumping about 25% from the previous year. The figure also rose about 20% in March and April, when tensions between the two Koreas have been high, with Pyongyang unilaterally demanding a 5% wage hike. There had been some concern about a possible slowdown in production because a wage tussle would make the North Koreans reluctant to work, but experts say that hasn't happened.
The North Koreans working at the complex are very skilled. Since their wages depend on how much they produce, the wage tussle at the complex hasn't had an impact on manufacturing there.
The Council of South Korean Firms operating in Kaesong also says that with North Korea having previously agreed to cooperate on improving production at the park, the wage row has not affected manufacturing volume either. The Kaesong complex, which began operating in 2004, logged a total production value of $15 million in the following year. A decade later, the figure had jumped to $470 million. Production at the joint inter-Korean Kaesong factory zone accounted for 99% of inter-Korean trade last year. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Now moving on to an update regarding the outbreak of Middle East respiratory syndrome here in Korea. And while no deaths were reported overnight, 2 MERS-infected patients were reported dead on Wednesday, and this raised the death toll to 35. The fatality rate of the MERS virus in Korea is now 18.8%. The nation has reported no additional fresh cases since Sunday, so the total number of people diagnosed remains at 186. Of that number, 31 remain in hospital, with 8 of those in unstable condition. The remaining 120 have been discharged after making complete recoveries. 689 people remain under quarantine, down from 811 on Wednesday. An elderly Korean lady who was forced into labor in the mid-1940s during Japan's colonial rule of Korea is calling on the Japanese government to apologize for the country's past atrocities. Her renewed efforts follow the UNESCO World Heritage Committee's acknowledgement this week of Japan's past use of Korean slave laborers. Son Jung-in reports.
Yang Geum-deok, who was forced into hard labor during Japan's colonial rule of Korea, visited Japan's National Diet Building in Tokyo on Wednesday. The purpose of her visit was to urge Japan to apologize and compensate Koreans who were forced to toil against their will in the early to mid-20th century. The 87-year-old was forced to work for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of Japan in the mid-1940s for 1.5 years. She was only 13 years old at the time. Noting that last month a Korean high court ruled in favor of the victim plaintiffs and ordered the Japanese company to pay each one of them over $100,000, Yang once again urged the Japanese court to be conscientious in making its judgment.
It's not too late. They should act rightly and apologize and compensate the victims as soon as possible.
In 1999, the Korean victims filed a lawsuit against Mitsubishi asking for compensation for the psychological distress they suffered, but the suit was ultimately dismissed by the Supreme Court of Japan. Japanese civil activists joined Yang during Wednesday's meeting. They have been by her side supporting and providing assistance for 16 years.
We are running out of time. We need to do our best to resolve this issue as quickly as possible.
The Japanese court acknowledges forced immobilization and labor, but at the same time maintains that all issues regarding its colonial rule, including sex slavery and monetary reparations, were covered by a 1965 agreement that normalized the relations between Korea and Japan. 손정인, Arirang News.
Debt-ridden Greece has formally requested a 3-year aid package from its creditors in return for renewed promises of economic reforms. Walking into mild cheers and audible boos, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras told the European Parliament in Strasbourg that concrete and credible proposals will be delivered to Brussels before the week is out and ahead of an emergency EU summit there on Sunday. Tsipras said his country has been turned into an austerity lab over the past 5 years, but the experiment had failed. Delivering an ultimatum after Greece's series of broken reform promises, European Council President Donald Tusk said there would be no more deadlines after this week. Lumping more misery onto the Greek people, the nation's state television has reported that Greek banks will stay shut for the rest of the week, with a €60 per day withdrawal limit at ATMs also remaining in place. The banks had originally been scheduled to reopen on Wednesday. Now, on top of the deepening crisis in Greece, China's tumbling financial markets are adding to uncertainties here in Korea, with many saying the situation in China is actually the larger global economic concern, with the Shanghai Composite Index falling nearly 6% Wednesday from the day before and by around 30% again in the span of just 3 weeks. The impact is becoming more and more pronounced here in Korea. The benchmark Kospi dropped below the psychologically important 2,000 mark within the first 15 minutes of trading on this Thursday. Now, it's the first time the Kospi has gone sub 2,000 since March. According to researcher Market, Chinese credit default swaps jumped to a 22-month high on Wednesday, which had the knock-on effect of sending Korea's CDS premium to a 5-month high. The index shows the nation's risk of defaulting on bonds it has issued. Arirang TV will launch a 24-hour news channel at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The global broadcaster you're watching right now has already pre-tested its service on the in-house network, just days ahead of its official start. Kwon So-ah has the details.
Arirang TV is just a step away from expanding its broadcasting service into another realm. Beginning next week, it'll be the first Korean UN in-house network channel. On Wednesday, a congratulatory event was held at Arirang Tower in Seoul ahead of the official launch.
Without the United Nations, it would have been difficult for South Korea to become independent. As this year marks the 70th anniversary of the UN's founding, it's very meaningful for Arirang TV to become part of its network, representing Korea.
The broadcaster will join around 20 other news channels, including CNN International, BBC World, Al Jazeera, and NHK, and be viewed on screens at the UN headquarters. In this way, Arirang TV will be able to more actively inform UN employees, diplomats, and the international community about Korea's history, foreign policies, inter-Korean issues, and more. The Arirang TV UN channel will differentiate its programming from the existing Arirang TV World, putting greater focus on news and current affairs. A special launching program will kick off on July 14th at 10 a.m. in New York or 11 p.m. in Seoul. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Well, those are the stories we've been following on this Thursday afternoon here in Seoul. For more of the latest, don't forget to check out our website. It has a new address, arirang.com, and do download our smartphone application. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.